By the time Margaret realized the house was swallowing her whole, her daughter was already on the phone saying she was coming home. That was the strange thing about grief. It never arrived like a thunderstorm. It arrived like dust. Softly. Slowly. Quiet enough that one day you looked around and realized it had settled on everything. Margaret woke at 6:15 the way she always did now, not because of an alarm, but because the house had taught her its rhythms and she had learned to obey them. The floorboards gave their low familiar groan in the cold. The back window rattled when the wind pushed in from the west. The pipes clicked somewhere behind the walls. And beneath all of it was that heavy, watchful silence that only exists in a house where someone used to live and laugh and move from room to room, and then one day simply didn't. She sat up slowly, wincing as her knees protested before the rest of her body had even decided whether it was ready to join the morning. At 72, every movement came with negotiation. She placed her feet on the braided rug beside the bed, the same rug she and Robert had bought at a craft fair in Vermont the summer Claire was 12. She could still see him standing there in the sunlight, holding up two rugs like the choice might alter the course of history. The blue one or the green one. He had studied both with absurd seriousness, brow furrowed, lips pressed together, as if the lake itself was somehow waiting on his verdict. He picked the blue. Said it looked like the water at dawn. That had been 30 years ago. The blue had long since faded into a tired grey. Robert had been gone for 3 years, 4 months, and 11 days. Margaret knew the exact number because grief, when left alone long enough, became mathematical. It counted for you. It measured time in holidays, empty chairs, untouched jackets, and the number of mornings no one said your name out loud. She stood carefully and made her way toward the kitchen. Even that short walk had become an obstacle course. A leaning tower of magazines waited by the bedroom door. A wingback chair held folded blankets, unopened mail, and a tote bag she vaguely remembered bringing home from church sometime before Christmas. 3 cardboard boxes stood against the wall like silent witnesses. She couldn't remember what was in them. Maybe winter clothes. Maybe old photo albums. Maybe nothing she needed anymore. That thought stopped her for half a second. Nothing she needed anymore. But she kept moving. The kitchen was still the brightest room in the house. The wide window over the sink let in the pale gold of an autumn morning, and beyond it the backyard waited in patient disarray. Margaret filled the kettle and set it on the burner. Then she stood there, hands resting lightly against the edge of the counter, staring without really seeing. The open shelves were crowded with the little leftovers of a long life. 14 mugs, though she only ever used one. 3 cast iron skillets she had not touched in 2 years because they were simply too heavy now. A ceramic rooster Claire had brought back from New Mexico in college, chipped on one wing but still impossible to throw away. An empty Danish butter cookie tin that had been sitting there since last Christmas because Robert used to open one every Christmas Eve, take a cookie, and say the same ridiculous thing every single year. I don't know why these only show up once a year. Margaret could hear his voice so clearly that for one dangerous second, her body almost turned as if he might still be there. But of course he wasn't. She poured her coffee and carried it to the kitchen table with both hands. Outside, the old maple in the far corner of the yard had begun to turn. Its leaves were shifting into those impossible October colors that made everything look briefly forgiven. The lawn needed raking. It had needed raking for at least 2 weeks. Robert would have been out there already. By 7, maybe earlier. Moving slowly through the leaves with that same deliberate patience he brought to almost everything. He never rushed. Even raking looked meaningful when he did it, as though the act itself were a kind of prayer. She used to bring his coffee out to him. Sometimes they would stand together in the cold and watch the leaves drift down one by one before going back inside. No one had raked that yard in 3 years. Margaret lifted the mug to her lips, then lowered it again before drinking. Something had caught her eye. She turned toward the living room. The morning light was slipping in through the window, touching the room in fragments. Not because the light was weak, but because there were too many things in its way. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't just glance at the room. She saw it. Really saw it. The bookshelves were packed tight, every row double-stacked. The sectional sofa had disappeared beneath folded quilts, a broken lamp, 2 shopping bags, and a box of VHS tapes for a machine they no longer even owned. The coffee table had not shown its surface in so long she couldn't quite remember its color. On the side table sat a flashlight with dead batteries. Near the window, 3 umbrellas, none of them trustworthy. On the floor, an unfinished needlepoint project, still threaded, still waiting. On the mantel, a sympathy card she had meant to mail nearly a year ago, to a friend who had died before Margaret ever got around to sending it. And there, in the corner, untouched and somehow still sacred, was Robert's leather recliner. No one sat in it. No one moved it. No one dusted it more than necessary. It remained exactly where it had always been, like the room had built itself around his absence and never learned how to recover. Margaret felt her breath catch. 40 years. That was what she was looking at. Not clutter. Not mess. Not carelessness. 40 years of marriage. 40 years of birthdays, winters, guests, receipts, grief, recipes, Christmases, broken lamps, books once loved, cards once meant, and objects that had somehow outlived the people and moments that made them matter. But another thought came right behind it, and this one landed hard enough to leave a bruise. She was not living in this house anymore. She was buried in it. Memory by memory. Object by object. One gentle excuse at a time. Margaret sat very still, mug warming her hands, and let that thought settle. She had spent 3 years telling herself she was preserving a life, honoring a marriage, keeping what mattered. But was she? Were these things really the memories? Or had she confused the container for the thing itself? Was Robert in the chair? In the coat closet? In the old cookie tin? In the dead flashlight and dusty magazines and unopened boxes? Or had Robert been somewhere else all along? Somewhere no cardboard box could hold. Somewhere no overfilled room could protect. The phone buzzed on the table, sharp enough to make her flinch. She looked down. Claire. Margaret answered and pressed the phone to her ear. Before she could say hello, Claire's voice came through warm, steady, and already certain. Mom, I'm coming Friday. I'm staying the week. Margaret looked out at the living room again. At the narrow paths. At the swallowed furniture. At the chair in the corner. At the house that had once held her life and now seemed to be holding her still. Something shifted inside her then. Not relief exactly. Not dread. Something closer to the feeling of a lock turning after years of rust. All right, sweetheart, she said softly. Come on home. And after she hung up, Margaret remained at the table for a long time, staring at the room as the morning light slowly pushed further in, revealing more of what had been hidden. For the first time, she did not look away. Claire arrived on a Friday afternoon, but Margaret felt her presence long before the car turned into the driveway. There's a certain kind of waiting that only happens when you know someone is coming back not just to visit, but to see you. Really see you. Margaret stood on the front porch with her coffee, fingers wrapped tightly around the mug like it might steady something deeper inside her. When the car finally pulled in, she straightened without realizing she had been leaning. Claire stepped out. For a split second, time bent. Margaret didn't see the 43-year-old woman walking toward her. She saw a 16-year-old girl slamming the car door, backpack half-zipped, hair a mess, full of life and impatience and everything that once filled this house. And then the moment passed. Claire smiled, and there she was again, older, steadier, carrying something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. They hugged on the porch. Not quickly. Not casually. Claire held on just a little longer than usual. Margaret noticed. She said nothing. Come inside, Margaret said finally. I made pot roast. That first evening felt normal. And that was almost dangerous. They sat at the kitchen table, eating slowly, talking about safe things. Claire's job. Her son Tyler starting middle school. The neighbor's dog that had apparently adopted Margaret's front steps as its afternoon resting place. They laughed. They nodded. They stayed in the kitchen, because both of them knew there was another room in the house waiting, and neither of them went near it. But the next morning, everything changed. It started quietly. Coffee. Corn muffins. Sunlight stretching across the table. Claire set her mug down. "Mom," she said gently, "can we talk about the house?" Margaret didn't look up right away. She took a sip of coffee, let it sit, then nodded once. "I figured we would." There was no anger in her voice, but there was something else. Readiness. Claire didn't rush. "I'm not here to throw everything away," she said. "I just want to help you go through things. It's a lot for one person." "I've been managing," Margaret replied. Claire nodded. She didn't argue, didn't push. Instead, she looked around the kitchen slowly. "Mom, when's the last time you had someone over for dinner?" The question landed softly, but it stayed. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it, thought about it honestly. "Thanksgiving," she said finally. 2 years ago. Claire didn't say anything after that. She didn't need to. That was the thing about Claire. She didn't force change. She revealed it. And then she waited. That afternoon, they didn't start with the living room. Too heavy. Too obvious. They started with the hallway closet. Neutral ground. Or at least, that's what Margaret thought. Until she opened it. Coats lined up from years that no longer mattered. Rain boots in sizes no one wore anymore. A broken badminton set from a 4th of July party she barely remembered. And then, the shelf. Random things that had drifted in and never left. Old coupons. Loose batteries. A single ice skate. Foreign coins. A flashlight she had been searching for all winter. Margaret picked things up one by one. And for each item, Claire asked the same quiet question. "Do you still use it?" Sometimes the answer came quickly. No. Those went into a pile. But sometimes, it took longer. "This coat," Margaret said, holding up a navy pea coat, "I wore it to your college graduation." Claire smiled. "It's beautiful. Do you still wear it?" Margaret paused, felt the fabric, remembered the day, then shook her head. "My shoulders don't like it anymore." Claire didn't comment. She simply placed it in the donate pile, gently, respectfully, as if it still mattered, because it did. And that's when something subtle shifted. This wasn't about throwing things away. It was about telling the truth. But then Margaret reached the back of the closet, and everything stopped. Her fingers brushed against something familiar before her eyes could see it. Soft wool. A weight she knew by heart. A scent that hadn't faded. She pulled it forward slowly. Robert's coat. The green one. Corduroy collar. Worn every fall. Every winter. The coat he wore when they drove out to see that farm they almost bought. The coat he had on the night they watched a storm roll across the fields while sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence. The coat that somehow still felt like him. "Oh," Margaret whispered. "There you are." Claire didn't move. Margaret held the coat against her chest. Not crying. Not speaking. Just breathing. And in that moment, the hallway closet wasn't a closet anymore. It was every year they had spent together. Every quiet morning. Every ordinary day that had once felt so small, and now felt enormous. "I forgot I put it here," Margaret said softly. Claire slowly sat down on the floor. Not to help. Not to fix. Just to be there. Margaret followed, lowering herself beside her daughter, the coat still in her lap. They sat in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't need filling. After a while, Claire spoke. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Margaret nodded. Claire hesitated, just for a second, then said it. "Do you think keeping all of this is helping you feel close to Dad?" A pause. Or is it making it harder to move forward? The question didn't sound harsh. It didn't sound accusing. It sounded honest. And that made it harder to ignore. Margaret looked down at the coat, ran her fingers slowly along the collar. She could have answered quickly, could have defended herself, could have said what she had been saying for 3 years. But instead, she stopped. And for the first time, she didn't answer from habit. She answered from somewhere deeper. I don't know, she said quietly. Then after a beat, but I think. I want to find out. The house was silent around them. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like something was about to begin. And neither of them said it out loud. But they both knew. This weekend wasn't about cleaning a house. It was about letting go of a life. Just enough to start living again. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. It wasn't unusual. Sleep had become something unreliable over the past 3 years. Some nights it came easily. Other nights, like this one, it stayed just out of reach. Like a word you almost remembered but couldn't quite say. She lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, Claire's question replaying over and over in her mind. Is it helping you feel close to Dad, or making it harder to move forward? It wasn't the kind of question you could ignore once it found its way in. At 2:07 a.m., Margaret gave up trying to sleep. She pulled on her robe and stepped into the hallway, careful with each step, as if the house itself might notice she was awake. The living room waited in silence. She didn't turn on the overhead light. Just the small lamp by the sofa. The room filled with a soft amber glow, the kind that made everything look older, softer, almost like a memory instead of a place. And then she did something she hadn't done in 3 years. She walked over to Robert's recliner and sat down. The leather creaked slightly under her weight, unfamiliar now, as if it had forgotten what it was like to hold someone. Margaret exhaled slowly. The coat was still there, folded on the sofa where she had left it earlier. She reached for it without thinking. The moment her hands touched it, something inside her shifted. Not sadness. Not exactly. Something deeper. Like opening a door she had kept closed on purpose. Robert Eugene Callahan had entered her life on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1974. A grocery store parking lot. A flat tire. A man who should have been somewhere else, but wasn't. He had knelt down in his good work pants without hesitation. Didn't complain. Didn't ask questions. Didn't make it a performance. 12 minutes later, the tire was changed. Margaret remembered standing there thinking 2 things at once. He's very capable. And he doesn't need to prove it. She married him 4 months later. Or at least, that's how it felt. In reality, it took a little longer. But the decision, that came quickly. She remembered the exact moment. A movie theater lobby. They were waiting for a film they had both already seen. Laughing about something she could no longer remember. And suddenly she thought, this is it. Not excitement. Not drama. Not fireworks. Just ease. And she knew. They married in June of 1976. Small ceremony. Her parents' backyard. Cheap chairs. Warm air. Simple vows that somehow held everything. Claire came 4 years later. The house came in 1983. They painted every room themselves. Argued about colors. Laughed about money. Made decisions that felt permanent without realizing how temporary everything actually was. Robert wanted the kitchen yellow. Margaret wanted it white. They compromised on something the paint store called antique linen. Neither of them liked it. They laughed about that for 40 years. The kitchen was still that color. Margaret sat in the recliner, holding the coat, letting the memories come without stopping them. That was new. Before, she would have pulled away. Distracted herself. Changed rooms. Turned on the TV. Anything to avoid staying too long in those moments. But tonight, she stayed. Robert retired in 2015. And strangely, those last years were the best. He slowed down, became quieter, more present. He read more, cooked long breakfasts on Sundays, drove her to book club and waited in the car with coffee and a crossword puzzle, just because he liked the quiet. It was like watching someone finally arrive at themselves. And then, one Tuesday morning in April, no warning, no time to prepare. He was in the backyard, raking leaves. And then, he wasn't. Margaret closed her eyes. Her fingers tightened slightly on the coat. That was the moment everything stopped. Not just his life. Hers too. At least, the version of it that moved forward. Because everything after that became about holding on. Holding the house the same way. Holding the chair in place. Holding the objects. Holding the routines. Holding anything that still looked like him. Because changing anything felt like losing him again. If the chair stayed. If the coat stayed. If the mug stayed on the shelf. Then somehow, in some quiet way, he was still there. She understood that. She had always understood that. But sitting there now, in his chair, in the middle of the night, something else became clear. The house had kept the shape of him, but it had also started to reshape her. Slowly, quietly, until she no longer noticed it happening. Until moving forward started to feel like betrayal. She opened her eyes, looked around the room, and for the first time, she didn't just see memories. She saw weight. She was still sitting there when she heard footsteps behind her. Claire, standing in the doorway, half awake, wrapped in that oversized Michigan sweatshirt she had been wearing since she was 19. Couldn't sleep either? Claire asked softly. Margaret shook her head. Come sit. Claire walked in and sat on the sofa, tucking her feet under her like she always used to. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Claire spoke. Mom, can I tell you something Dad said to me? Margaret turned slightly. A few weeks before he died, Claire added. That got her attention. He called me out of nowhere, Claire continued, just to talk. You know how he did that sometimes. Margaret nodded. And then, he said something I didn't really understand at the time. Claire paused, like she was choosing her words carefully. He said, I've been thinking about all the things people collect over a lifetime. Margaret's fingers stilled on the coat. And he said, I think the only things worth keeping are the ones that still have a job to do. The room went very quiet. Claire looked at her mother. And then he said something else. Margaret didn't speak. She just waited. Claire took a breath. He said, if anything ever happens to me, I don't want your mom spending her life taking care of my things, instead of living her life. Margaret felt something inside her crack open. Not painfully, but completely. She's got too much living left in her for that, Claire finished. Silence filled the room again. But this time, it felt different. Not heavy. Not suffocating. Clear. Margaret looked down at the coat. Really looked at it. Not as a memory. Not as a piece of him. But as something in her hands. Right now. In the present. And for the first time, she understood something she hadn't been ready to understand before. The coat wasn't Robert. The chair wasn't Robert. The house wasn't Robert. Those were just places his life had passed through. The real thing had always been somewhere else. She folded the coat slowly, carefully, smoothed the collar, set it beside her. Then she looked at Claire. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but steady. Okay. Claire leaned forward slightly. Okay. Margaret nodded. Tell me how we do this. And in that moment, something shifted. Not the past. Not the loss. But the direction of what came next. They didn't start with a plan. And strangely, that was exactly what made it work. Saturday morning arrived quietly. No pressure. No big announcement. Just 2 cups of coffee, soft light through the window, and a house that felt like it was holding its breath. Claire stood in the living room, hands on her hips, looking around. "Okay," she said lightly. "We don't need to do everything today." Margaret nodded. But something inside her had already shifted. "I don't want to wait anymore," she said. Claire turned, surprised. Margaret took a slow breath and looked around the room again. Not the way she used to. Not defensively. Not emotionally. Clearly. "I've been waiting 3 years," she added. "I think that's long enough." Claire studied her for a moment. Then nodded. "All right," she said softly. "Then let's just start. No speeches. No complicated systems. Just one simple rule. Every object gets one question. Does it still have a job to do?" At first it felt almost too simple. Margaret picked up a ceramic mixing bowl from the kitchen. "This one," she said, turning it in her hands. "I used it every Thanksgiving. There was one year the spoon broke right in the middle of cooking." Claire smiled. "Sounds important." Margaret nodded. "It is." She placed it in the keep pile. That felt easy. Too easy. But then came the next thing. A set of decorative plates from the dining room cabinet. Blue patterns. Delicate edges. Generations old. Margaret held one carefully. "My mother's," she said. Claire didn't interrupt. Margaret continued, almost as if explaining it to herself. "She used them every Sunday. And her mother before that." Claire waited. Margaret looked at the plate. Then looked toward the cabinet where they had been sitting untouched for years. "Does it still have a job to do?" Claire asked gently. Margaret didn't answer right away. She thought about the last time they were used. 12 years. Maybe more. She remembered feeling nervous every time they were on the table. Worried about chips. Cracks. Accidents. She loved them. But she didn't live with them. She protected them. And suddenly, that felt different. What if someone else used them? Margaret said slowly. Claire tilted her head slightly. "Someone who actually puts them on a table." There was a pause. Then Margaret nodded. "They go," she said. "But not just anywhere." Claire smiled softly. "Of course. I know exactly who would love these," Margaret added. And just like that, something changed. Letting go didn't feel like losing anymore. It felt like passing something forward. They moved through the house slowly. The VHS tapes were easy. Gone. The broken lamp that had been waiting to be fixed for 3 years? Gone. The stacks of magazines? Gone in batches. With each stack removed, something reappeared. The sofa. The table. The floor. Space. Actual space. Margaret stood back at one point and blinked. "I forgot this was here," she said, staring at a section of wall that hadn't been visible in years. Claire laughed softly. "That's a good sign. But not everything was easy. Some things stopped them completely." At one point, Margaret opened a drawer and found a bundle of birthday cards. Every card Claire had ever given them. From crayon drawings to carefully written adult messages. She sat down right there on the floor. And started reading. One by one. Claire didn't rush her. Didn't check the time. Didn't suggest moving on. She just sat beside her. And listened to the quiet sound of pages turning. "These stay," Margaret said eventually. Claire smiled. Obviously. Then came the letters. A small box at the bottom of the bookshelf. Margaret already knew what was inside before she opened it. Robert's letters. From before they were married. When he lived in Chicago and she was still finishing school. They had written to each other twice a week. Because long-distance calls were expensive. But also, because he had something to say. Margaret opened the first letter. read the first line, then closed it again. Her hand rested on the box. "These aren't things," she said quietly. Claire's voice was immediate. "No. These are him." Silence. Then Margaret nodded. "Keep." They continued. Hour after hour. Not rushing. Not forcing. Just asking the same question again and again. Does it still have a job to do? And slowly, the house began to answer. By late afternoon, the room felt different. Not empty. Not cold. Alive. There was space between things now. Light moved differently. It stretched across the floor, uninterrupted, as if it had been waiting years for this moment. Margaret stood in the middle of the living room. And just breathed. Deep. Full. Clear. "I forgot," she said quietly. Claire stepped beside her. "What?" Margaret looked around slowly. "The light," she said. "I forgot the light used to come in like this." Claire followed her gaze. The windows. The floor. The softened edges of a room that could finally be seen again. "It's a beautiful room," Claire said. Margaret nodded. "It always was." A pause. "I just couldn't see it." She thought about Robert. About the way he moved through life. Simple. Present. Uncluttered in a way that had nothing to do with objects. And for the first time, she understood something she had missed before. The house was never meant to hold their life forever. It was just where their life had happened. And somewhere along the way, she had stopped living in it. And started preserving it. Margaret exhaled slowly. Then turned to Claire. "What do we do tomorrow?" she asked. Claire smiled. "That depends," she said, "on what you're ready for next." Margaret looked down the hallway. Toward the bedroom. Toward the place she had avoided the longest. Her expression shifted slightly. Not fear. Not hesitation. Something quieter. "I think," she said slowly, "we go there next." And just like that, the hardest part was waiting. Sunday morning didn't feel the same. For the first time in a long time, Margaret didn't wake up with that quiet heaviness sitting on her chest. She noticed it immediately. Not because something was there, but because something wasn't. She sat on the edge of the bed, hands resting on her knees, looking around the room. The same bed. The same curtains. The same dresser. And yet, something had shifted. "I'm not dreading today," she whispered to herself. That realization alone felt unfamiliar. She stood up slowly, got dressed, and walked toward the kitchen. The house felt lighter. Not empty. Just breathable. She made her coffee and stood at the window. The maple tree in the backyard had turned further overnight. More gold now than green. The leaves were starting to fall faster. The yard still needed raking. But for the first time in 3 years, Margaret didn't look at it with avoidance. She looked at it and thought, maybe I'll do it this week. Not because she had to. Because she wanted to. That thought stayed with her. Claire came downstairs a little later, hair slightly messy, still wrapped in that oversized sweatshirt. She paused when she saw her mother standing in the living room. "You're up early," Claire said. Margaret nodded. "I've been thinking." Claire smiled faintly. "In a good way?" Margaret turned to her. "I think so." They sat at the kitchen table again. Same as yesterday. But this time, the silence felt different. Not careful. Not avoiding anything. Open. Margaret took a sip of coffee. Then set the mug down. "I want to do the bedroom today." Claire froze for just a second. That was it. That was the room. The one they had both been circling. "The room itself?" Claire asked carefully. Margaret nodded. "Not the closet." A pause. Claire studied her mother's face. "Are you sure?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands. Then back up. "I don't think I'll ever feel ready," she said honestly. A breath. But I don't want to wait for that anymore. Claire held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Okay. No hesitation after that. No overthinking. They walked down the hallway together. And somehow, it felt like crossing a line. Margaret pushed the door open. The room hadn't changed much. That was the first thing she noticed. Everything was almost exactly where it had always been. Her side had shifted slightly over the years. But his side. It was like time had stopped. The shape of him was still there. His drawer. His space. His absence. Margaret stepped inside slowly. Every movement felt louder in here. More intentional. They started with the dresser. Claire didn't say anything. She just stood nearby. Present. Margaret reached for the top drawer. Her hand hesitated for just a moment. Then she opened it. Inside. Everything was still there. Folded neatly. Exactly the way he used to keep it. Handkerchiefs. Cufflinks. A tie clip in a small velvet box. And his watch. Margaret picked it up. The weight of it surprised her. Or maybe, she had just forgotten. This, she said softly, he wore every day. Claire stepped a little closer. Margaret turned the watch in her hand. Then said something unexpected. Tyler should have this. Claire looked up quickly. When he's older, Margaret added, he should know what it feels like to wear something that mattered. Claire nodded, her voice quieter now. He'd love that. Margaret placed the watch gently aside. Then she noticed something underneath. A folded piece of paper. She opened it. A grocery list. Simple. Ordinary. Coffee. Orange juice. That good bread from Elm Street. Cheddar. And then, call Claire. Margaret stared at it. A small smile appeared. He always wrote that down, she said. Claire let out a soft breath. He never forgot. Margaret nodded. I know. She folded the paper carefully. Placed it next to the watch. Both of these go to you, she said. Claire didn't argue. Didn't deflect. She just accepted it. They continued. Drawer by drawer. Some things were easier. A second robe. Old shirts. Clothes that still carried his shape but no longer had a place in her life. But they moved slower around certain things. The nightstand. Margaret picked up the framed photo. The two of them at the Grand Canyon. Sunlight. Wind. Laughter caught mid-moment. Not posed. Not prepared. Just real. That stays, Margaret said. Claire smiled. Obviously. They worked quietly through the room. Time moved differently here. Slower. Heavier. But not unbearable. Not anymore. By noon, something had changed. The room wasn't empty. It wasn't stripped. It was clearer. Like a sentence with too many words finally edited down to what mattered. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed. Looked around. And felt it. That tightness in her chest. The one she had lived with for 3 years. It loosened. Just slightly. But enough. I think, she said slowly. Claire sat beside her. What? Margaret took a breath. I think I've been holding my breath this whole time. Claire didn't speak. She just listened. And I'm just now starting to breathe again. Silence. But this time, it felt peaceful. Not heavy. Margaret reached beside her. The green coat. She had carried it from room to room all weekend. Not ready. Not yet. But now. She held it again. Let the memories come. All of them. The parking lot. The wedding. The kitchen arguments. The Sunday mornings. The quiet years. She didn't stop any of it. Didn't push it away. Just let it be there. And then something new happened. She didn't feel like she needed to hold on to it anymore. She folded the coat carefully. Smoothed the collar. The way he used to. There's a shelter on Madison Street, she said. Claire looked at her. They take men's coats. A pause. He volunteered there once, Margaret added. Never told me. I found the letter later. Claire stayed very still. Margaret looked down at the coat. Then back up. I think it should go there. Another pause. I think he'd recognize the place. Claire reached over and took her hand. Held it tightly. Outside, the wind moved through the maple tree. Leaves drifted down slowly. Golden. Quiet. Unhurried. Margaret sat in the room they had shared for 40 years. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was losing him. She felt like she was finally letting him go. The right way. Monday morning, Margaret did something she hadn't done in years. She made a list. Not groceries. Not chores. Not the kind of list that keeps a house running. This one was different. She sat at the kitchen table early, before Claire came downstairs, a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen resting lightly between her fingers. At the top of the page, she wrote slowly, "Things I want my life to contain." She stared at the words for a long moment. Because for the first time in a very long time, she wasn't thinking about what she had lost. She was thinking about what was still possible. That alone felt like a quiet revolution. She took a breath. And began. Morning coffee on the back porch. The farmer's market on Saturdays. Writing letters. Real ones. Ink on paper. Calling Tyler every Sunday night. Joining her book club again. Learning watercolor painting. Raking the yard slowly in autumn, just to feel the air. Driving out to see the sandhill cranes in early spring. She paused after writing that last one. Her hand hovered slightly above the page. That had been their tradition. Every year. Same place. Same time. Same quiet excitement. And for 3 years, she hadn't gone. Because it felt wrong to go without him. Now, it felt wrong not to go at all. She placed the pen down. Looked at the list. It wasn't long. But it was hers. And more importantly, every single thing on it was still available to her. Right now. Claire walked in just then, hair tied back, still waking up. She poured coffee, then noticed the legal pad. "Grocery list?" she asked. Margaret shook her head slightly. "Better." Claire sat down and read it quietly. No interruptions. No commentary. When she finished, she looked up. And there it was again. That expression. The one Margaret used to see on Robert's face. The one that meant, "This matters." "You should go see the cranes," Claire said softly. Margaret nodded. "I will." And this time, it didn't sound like something she was saying to be polite. It sounded like a decision. They spent that morning differently. No sorting. No piles. No decisions about objects. Instead, they sat in the living room. In a room that could finally be seen again. And Margaret talked. Not about the past. Not about grief. About the future. What she wanted. What she had avoided wanting. What she thought she wasn't allowed to want anymore. "I think I'll sign up for that watercolor class," she said. Claire didn't hesitate. "Then do it." Margaret smiled slightly. "I always thought you had to be good at something before you started." Claire laughed. "Mom, it's a community class. You just show up." Margaret laughed too. And it surprised her. Not the sound. The feeling. It didn't feel forced. It didn't feel like something she was doing to prove she was okay. It just happened. They talked about small things. Patricia next door. The book club she hadn't attended in months. The quiet way people had stopped inviting her, not because they didn't care, but because she had made herself unreachable. And then, Tyler. Margaret grew quiet. "He's 12 now," she said. Claire nodded. "He is." Margaret looked down at her hands. "I don't really know him." The truth sat there between them. Uncomfortable, but honest. I've been so focused on holding on to what I had, she continued slowly. I haven't been paying attention to what's still being built. Claire didn't interrupt. She just reached across the table and placed her hand gently over her mother's. That was enough. That afternoon, they finished the living room. The bookshelves came last. Margaret ran her fingers along the spines. Books she had read once. Books she had loved. Books she had forgotten. Claire didn't rush her. Which ones still have a job? She asked. Margaret smiled faintly. That question again. But this time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt helpful. She chose the ones that mattered. The ones she had underlined. The ones that had changed her. The ones she knew she would come back to. The rest went into boxes. Not discarded carelessly. Given a second life. Margaret even wrote a small note to go with them. These belong to a man who believed a good book should be read more than once. I hope they find someone who feels the same. Claire read it. Didn't say anything. But her eyes softened. Then came the recliner. Robert's chair. It had never been part of the question. It was staying. Always. But Claire looked at it. Then at the window. Can we try something? She asked. Margaret hesitated. Then nodded. Together, they moved it. Just slightly. Turned it away from the television. Faced it toward the window. Toward the yard. Toward the maple tree. Margaret stepped back. Looked at it. And something about it felt right. You can see everything from there, Claire said. Margaret nodded slowly. I don't know why we never did that before. Claire smiled. Maybe you weren't ready to see it yet. By late afternoon, the room was finished. Not empty. Not new. But clear. Margaret stood in the center. The same place she had stood just days ago. But this time, she didn't feel surrounded. She felt present. She looked at the chair. At the window. At the light. And then she said something she hadn't said in years. I think I'm going to stay. Claire looked at her. You mean, here? Margaret nodded. Yes. A pause. But not like before. Claire understood. Not surviving. Not preserving. Living. That evening, they sat together as the sun went down. No TV. No distractions. Just the quiet hum of a house that no longer felt heavy. Margaret leaned back in the recliner. Her chair now. Facing the window. Watching the last light fall through the trees. And for the first time, she didn't feel like she was holding on to something that was gone. She felt like she was finally holding on to something that was still here. Her life. Friday came again. Exactly 1 week after Claire had arrived. And this time, the house felt different. Not quieter. Not emptier. Just lighter. Margaret stood in the kitchen early that morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunlight stretch across the floor. The same light. The same window. The same house. But it no longer felt like something she was trapped inside. It felt like something she was finally living in again. Claire came down with her suitcase half-packed. She moved slower this morning. Not because she didn't want to leave, but because she knew something had changed here. Feels different, Claire said, glancing around. Margaret nodded. It is. A pause. I think I can breathe in here again. Claire smiled. They didn't rush breakfast. Didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. They didn't need to. Some things didn't need to be said out loud anymore. Afterward, they walked out to the porch together. The air was cooler now. More leaves had fallen. The yard still needed raking. Margaret looked at it. Then set her coffee down. I'm going to do that today, she said. Claire raised an eyebrow. Today. Margaret nodded. Not because it needs to be done. A small smile. Because I want to. Claire studied her for a second, then smiled back. That sounds like you. Margaret let out a quiet breath. I think it is. They stood there a little longer. Then Claire turned. I should finish packing. Margaret nodded. All right. But neither of them moved right away. There was something else. Something unfinished. Claire finally spoke. Mom. Margaret looked at her. Thank you, Claire said. Margaret frowned slightly. For what? Claire hesitated. For not shutting me out, she said. For letting me in. Even when it was hard. Margaret's expression softened. I didn't realize how much I had shut everyone out, she admitted. Claire nodded gently. You didn't mean to. A pause. You were just trying to hold on. Margaret looked out at the yard again. At some point, holding on and holding yourself back start to look the same, she said quietly. Claire didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew it was true. By noon, Claire was ready to leave. The car was packed. The house was quiet again, but not the same kind of quiet as before. This one didn't feel empty. It felt open. They stood by the car. One last moment. You'll call Tyler? Claire asked. Margaret nodded. Sunday night. Claire smiled. He's going to love that. Margaret reached out and hugged her daughter. This time. She didn't hold on too tightly. Didn't cling. Just held her. Present. Then let go. Claire got into the car. Started the engine. Rolled down the window. I'll come back soon, she said. Margaret smiled. I know. And she meant it. Not as a hope. As a certainty. The car pulled away slowly. Margaret stood there until it disappeared at the end of the street. Then she turned. And walked back inside. The house greeted her the way it always had. But now, it felt different. She walked into the living room. Sunlight filled the space. Nothing blocked it anymore. She moved to the recliner. Sat down. Looked out the window. The maple tree swayed gently. Leaves drifting down one by one. And then, Margaret stood up again. She walked to the closet. Picked up her coat. Not his. Hers. She stepped outside. Into the yard. The air was crisp. Cool. Alive. She found the rake leaning against the side of the house. Her hands wrapped around the handle. For a moment. She hesitated. Then she pulled. Leaves gathered slowly. Softly. The sound of them moving across the ground. It was familiar. Not painful. Not heavy. Just present. She worked slowly. No rush. No goal. Just movement. Just breath. Just being there. At one point she stopped. Looked up. The sky stretched wide above her. And for the first time in a very long time, she didn't feel like she was looking backward. She felt like she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. Right here. Right now. Alive. Later that evening, Margaret returned inside. She washed her hands. Made herself dinner. Simple. Quiet. Enough. Then she walked into the living room again. Sat in the recliner. Facing the window. The last light of the day fading slowly. She picked up the notebook from the table. Opened it. Read the list again. Things I want my life to contain. She added one more line at the bottom. Letting go. Without losing love. Margaret closed the notebook. Set it down. And leaned back. The house was still. But it no longer felt like it was holding on to the past. It felt like it was making space. For whatever came next. And for the first time in 3 years. Margaret wasn't afraid of that. She was ready. If you were in her place, would you have the courage to let go of what you've been holding on to for so long? Or would you keep holding on, even if it meant standing still? Tell me in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one waiting for you next.